Hello, I'm John Molesky, and this is Wilson Center Now, a production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. My guest today is Jennifer Sciubba. Jennifer is an internationally recognized expert in the field of demographic security. She's currently a Wilson Center Public Policy Fellow with the Environmental Change and Security Program while on leave from the Department of International Studies at Rhodes College. Among her works is this most recent book, 8 Billion and Counting: How Sex, Death, and Migration Shape Our World. And Jen joins us on the eve of a day that the UN has predicted, November 15th, that 8 billion number will officially be met. Jennifer, welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, John. I'm so happy to be able to join you.
Yeah, it's terrific to have you, and especially on this historic moment for the human race. A population explosion over the last 100 years, the progress or the growth was not as rapid as it had been prior to that. Why has the last 100 years been such an explosion in the number of people living on the planet?
Yeah, it's amazing when we look at this century compared to last century. Last century, we started with 1.6 billion people and ended with 6.1 billion. And that's mainly because we learned how to conquer death for children and babies. And so our ability to really put in place public health systems and execute on that knowledge helped us to have people live longer, which means they live into their reproductive years. And when you're having, fertility tends to be high in societal development in the early stages, but so does mortality. And so births and deaths kind of equal out. But once you are able to get people living longer, they're still having a lot of children. That's when you really see populations explode. And so that's what happened last century. But as we moved into the second half of that century, we did start to see some big shifts that are what's going to characterize this century, which is falling fertility among those with the highest incomes.
So in many ways, what you describe is we're, to the degree that this is a problem, we're victims of our own success. We are beating nature in many ways that previous generations could not.
I'm so glad that you phrased it that way, because that's actually really how I try to push the line for people. That, I think with population, people tend to focus on the negatives. No matter what, there's either too many people, or now increasingly the refrain is there's too few people. But nobody's ever just happy with where we are. But our population trends do reflect tremendous success. So when we had this population explosion, which we might want to use air quotes for, it was because of tremendous shifts in public health in part, and then it takes fertility a bit to catch up. Now, where we have these aging and increasingly shrinking populations, that's because people feel like if they have children, they're going to live full adult lives, so they don't want to have as many of them. Populations are aging because we're living longer. Great, that's really something to celebrate. So it always has this veneer of negativity around population trends, but there's much to celebrate about where we are today.
And just you and your publisher provided some pretty amazing numbers, and it's hard to wrap your head around these things when you're talking billions. But if we bring it down to a human scale, just in the last minute, you and I were talking, according to these projections, 169 more people were born on planet Earth in 1 minute, and about a 250,000 every day we're adding.
There's a lot of people every day. Oh. And that's a lot of people laugh at me. They're like, November 15th, are you sure we'll hit 8 billion November 15th? I said, look, we're going to hit and roll right past it, and you will have blinked and it's gone. It really is a lot of people every day. And I think it is so hard to wrap our brains around this number and forget that when we see numbers like that, it's us. We are in this. And that is one of the things that really troubles me when we say that there are too many people. And it's because we're talking about ourselves. We're talking about our neighbors and our friends and our children and our grandparents. And so it's really important to realize these are aggregates of individual trends.
But what we do see is, you can't place people where you'd like to put them, right? So in some cases, it's a hostile environment environmentally. In other cases, it's a country that has poor governance and perhaps lots of poverty. In wealthier countries that maybe could absorb more people, you see this decrease. So it's uneven across the board is the picture that your book portrays.
Absolutely. I think, as we said, last century was one of exponential population growth. And I think this century, particularly this moment, it's one of differential trends where we see such stark divides in birth, death, and migration, as you point out, trends around the world. Japan's median age is 48 years old. So if you lined everyone in the country up from youngest to oldest, and you asked that middle person to raise their hand, how old are you? Be 48. You do the same thing in Nigeria, that person's 18. That's a really stark difference there. And, people don't get to choose where they are born, but their circumstances in life are very much dictated by where they're born.
While we were on Japan, you have a fascinating statement about Japan in the book. Japan is aging so rapidly that if current trends continue, the nation could eventually disappear altogether. Explain that to us. It sounds like hyperbole.
It does. And the funny thing is, I'm one of your least alarmist people you will ever speak to about population trends. And yet I'm okay putting that statement in there because it's math. So what we're saying, I think it's very useful for us to say, if nothing changes, then what? Because when we're all policy minded folks like we are at the Wilson Center, we think, where is room for policy to make a difference? So if nothing changes, children per woman on average, and just so you know, replacement level would of course be 2 for the parents, right? Somewhere around 2. And so if you have 1.3, that's considered very low. And then people are living to old ages, but over time, the population shrinks infinitely. I mean, the question we would have is, at what point would there be societal changes where maybe families would start growing larger? But we don't know when that point would be.
What about efforts to control these variables? You write about these various times where different countries have taken different approaches to either encourage or discourage birth rates. What does the record tell us about humans' ability to manipulate these numbers?
Well, and I think the amazing thing for us to point out is every country tries to manipulate it in some way or another. Democracies are not immune to that, which is actually my Wilson Center project, is looking at the history of that in the United States. And so we know that we have success investing in societies that have very high fertility. And in environmental change and security program, we've done a lot of work over the years looking at how access to family planning and reproductive health, that would be rights-based family planning, so non-coercive means, and increasing education for girls in particular, lowers fertility in places where it is really high. And it has worked. I mean, I think that's an amazing thing that people don't realize. When I started studying population trends when I was an undergraduate, actually the day we hit 6 billion, I'll always remember, in 1999, we had about 38 countries in the world that had fertility rates of 5 or more. So women in those countries had 5 or more children on average. Today there are 8. So there has been a huge change in that. So we know that this wonderful package of family planning and education works. And bonus, it yields tremendous social dividends to really help these countries develop. Where we're not successful, however, in policy realm is raising fertility when it is below replacement. And, I think pretty much the audience for now could understand that. What could a government do to get you personally to have more children? I hope you laugh when you hear that, because you think, boy, there's not a lot. And it depends on
right now, absolutely nothing, but that's an age and stage thing. So I bet
age and stage is part of it. And then, for me, age and stage as well. But, my life is full would be a nice way to put it. Happy where I am with my 2 kids, my replacement level kids. Throwing money at women to get them to have children, you will see tiny blips. So we've seen this in Russia, for example, over the years. They'll try to give $16,000 to mothers to have an extra kid, give mothers medals, tax incentives, so on. You might see a tiny blip, but demographers have pointed out what it does is it says, if you know you only want to have 1 or 2 children in your lifetime, you might time it to get the money. It doesn't make you have more kids. And so we do see limits to policy at those lower fertility.
And bringing this back to that human scale, let's talk about the way this manifests within a society. So if you have centenarians as the largest growing age group in the world, these aren't people who are working and paying taxes. These are retirees, right. In some cases in poor health. So the conventional wisdom says this puts an increasing burden on the younger people within a population. And as you described in Japan and in the US and elsewhere, that median age keeps getting higher and higher and higher. So what are the list of problems that emerge as a result of this dynamic?
I think one thing for us to note at the beginning is that the same population trend does not look the same for us because they are the vanguard of this trend, a trend that we've never had before in all of human history. And what has happened to Japan? Are they in the dustbin of economic history? No, they're not. I think that's something we almost never focus on. The world's oldest country is still one of the strongest economies in the world. What that tells us is that there is room for policy. And so those of us who try to understand what policies can be most effective in making use of the population that a country has, we can look to Japan for that. So some things that could make a difference. Still
What are
remaining a country.
Oh,
Yeah,
I'm
you want
sorry,
to be
Jen.
a country, yeah, that could be invested. You want people to look at you as a solid investment opportunity. And that's not the case for all aging countries out there. Business friendly climates, high human capital. They also are working, I would say, in progress to make it so that people who want to work longer can. Because in a lot of countries that are aging, there's mandatory retirement. You might get kicked out of the workforce at 65 or younger, but 65 doesn't mean the same thing that it used to,
Mhm.
and 65 doesn't mean the same to everyone. So we know that in Japan, the average age that people actually exit the workforce is higher than the official retirement age because they find ways to work longer because they want to. Some cases, of course, they might have to. But in France, the average age of exit is a full 10 years younger than in Japan, even though France is demographically younger. So we have lots of room at the margin to keep people in the workforce longer and make good use of their skills.
What can a country do though when the trend is in the opposite direction and people don't want to stay in the workforce? So
Yeah.
you hear in the U.S. we've been talking about Social Security running out of money for decades, and some of that is political scare tactics. But clearly, as we age as a society, those concerns continue to mount.
John, I think that's a very good example. And it's one that I think we weren't raising a red flag on. So I said a minute ago that the same population trend doesn't look the same in every country that's aging. I get really concerned when I hear a lot of US policymakers point attention to China, for example, as
Mhm.
a country that is aging rapidly and saying, oh, the US, we're doing so much better than China. I think we need to put some caution there because our political system in America makes it very difficult to get big policy changes. I think everybody knows that. Name the issue. It's hard to get big policy changes. And so when you have a democracy where we have a special, I think, flavor of polarization, but just in general, democracies are supposed to be accountable to the people. And when you try to say, we're going to make this social security system more sustainable or raise retirement ages across the board in democracies, we see this in the OECD, voters say, no, you're not. We're not doing this. It's hard to do that long term planning. But if we're talking about aging in a society where the government is not held as accountable to the people, they actually have the ability to make those kinds of changes without the same kind of political penalties. And so I think we should note that just even if China ages faster than the US, we actually may be in bigger trouble than them fiscally.
Hmm. So if you read the reviews of your book, which how could you resist? A
Yes,
lot of people.
you try not to just read the happy ones.
That's right. Well, a lot of people have made the point that you're looking at this demographic lens in new ways, in fresh ways, and applying it across the board on state building, security development, things that it has been underutilized as a tool for. Is that what you found in your research and as your thinking has developed on this, that when we look at the forces that shape our planet, that this is an underutilized or underestimated element?
Yes, I think demography is really the key to reading the world. And when we look through that lens, we see so many things that we wouldn't see otherwise. I also think that most people actually use demography in their work and they just don't realize it. So, if you're in the business community and you're thinking about risk or growth or market position, you're thinking about demographics. In the military and intelligence communities where I've spent my career working with those communities, of course they're thinking about the future. Where are the challenges and opportunities? But I think when everybody knows a little something about demographics, which is great, but we have to know how to use it the right way. So there are certain kinds of traps that we want to avoid. For example, we often bring our biases into the data. And
Mhm.
so we see what we want to see, or we look for things that confirm what we already think. I think that's one of the things that I saw some people in the US military community get wrong about Russia's demographics. Last decade, they were in really dire demographic state, losing population to the tune of 600,000 people a year sometimes, and having terrible life expectancy for males. And so some in the national security community in power, in high positions of power, assessed that we just didn't have to worry about Russia anymore, that they wouldn't be able to field an army. And then here we sit today. It's because demography is not destiny. So we have to think about our bias. Did we want to see a weak Russia so that we could see a strong US? Did we pick and choose which demographic variables that we looked at? Did we forget about context, such as a regime type? So we can use demography, but what I try to do in the book is explain how to do so, the kinds of questions we should ask.
Tell us what some of those are, Jen. This is fascinating. And I also wonder, are there other areas of the world that you're looking at now that would follow the same trend as our misreading of the situation in Russia?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, I think China is one of them. So I actually had this presentation a few weeks ago that, as I prepared for it, I pulled some of those headlines from newspapers about Russia in the mid 2000s. They were great titles, Russia's, population implosion, and lots of bombs, and drunken nation, I think, was really close parallel that we have to be careful about, just projecting the desire for a competitor to be weak onto the data. I also think that it's important for us to realize that trends do change. So I mentioned earlier how rapidly population, high fertility countries, the number of them has shrank over time. If we really think about it, where were you when you had your first impression of demographic trends, and what were those trends like? For a lot of baby boomers, it was the 1960s and early 1970s when they first became aware of population trends, and they became aware of it because they heard that we're all, quote unquote, breeding ourselves to death. And there were 125 countries with fertility of 5 or more. Now there are 8, as I said before. So we have to be aware that these trends really change, and that two things can be true at once. And I really think that is our big challenge right now. It is true that there are still a few places in the world where fertility is really high. Most of these places are in Sub-Saharan Africa, where they're facing, as we know, tremendous strains from environmental changes, droughts, floods. The population is dependent on the land, and the population is growing, but the land is degrading in terms of risk. It's also true that we have some of the oldest countries on the planet that are typically peaceful democracies. And so we want to understand what are the challenges and opportunities, mainly in the economic realm, for those countries. We only have so much time in the day. How do you understand that both of these things are true at once, and try to set a policy agenda that takes account of this huge diversity?
Yeah, complexity doesn't like black and white, does it? When you look at regions of the world that are experiencing these youth bulges, whether it's in Africa or whether the Middle East, the challenges for these countries are obvious if you look at this through the negative lens, right? That you have a large youth population, you don't have enough good jobs to go around. That never is a good mixture. But what are the challenges for those countries, and in terms of opportunities, right?
Yeah.
The flip side of that coin.
Yeah. Well, the same way that we said aging isn't going to look the same in every country, I think it should be heartening for us that having a young population doesn't look the same. So just because you have a youthful population does not mean you will be mired in conflict and you will be unable to develop. And we see some really good success stories in Sub-Saharan Africa of countries that have had relatively youthful populations, but have really started to, I would say, pull themselves into higher income. One of the interesting comparisons we could make would be between Botswana and Nigeria. So Botswana actually had higher fertility than Nigeria after 1950. But then in the 1970s, the leadership in Botswana instituted free and available family planning. They really doubled down on girls' education. And when you look at the trend line, Nigeria has this very gradual and small fall from about 7 to 5, but Botswana goes from that same number down to 2.89, just a really rapid fall. And so leadership matters. And we see this throughout Sub-Saharan Africa. We had an event through the Maternal Health Initiative at the Wilson Center and the Environmental Change and Security Program just a couple of weeks ago, where we had panelists from Uganda who was talking about that government doing more than in the past to integrate some of these services into the national population plan that will set the country on a greater path towards really rich human capital and economic development. So the opportunities are there because we're looking for workers. We know where will all the workers be globally? They will be in Africa. But if you want to be the country that can make the most of your demography, you have to have a leadership that really believes in the value of family planning and education and investments in human capital and puts those things in place to make the most use of that.
And I should tell our viewers that the Maternal Health Initiative event that Jennifer references can be found on the Wilson Center website. If you go to the events tab and look at past events, you can find that excellent encounter that Jen just described. You know, something that's really admirable both in the book and in your presentation today is how you do practice what you preach and don't go down some path of letting your biases guide you. And you've managed to, you know, find both the yin and the yang on these questions. I want to ask you about that in terms of your experience as an author and the journey from when you get the idea for the book, you begin the research, you begin writing, how your thinking evolved over the course of getting from the introduction or the pitch to the final page.
That is a great question. And I was absolutely surprised to see myself end my writing as an optimist because I have taught environmental politics for a long time. And it's all sad, basically. We don't have a lot of great news when it comes to the environment. And so on the whole, I think, you know, that colors my perception. I also, through work in the national security community, have looked a lot at youthful populations and the conflict and development challenges. But as I wrote this book, and I really had to realize how much trends have changed, when I finished, I thought, oh, if we'll just keep doing what we're doing, and that's the key, you have to still invest. But if we keep doing what we're doing, we're headed down the right path. There is one more evolution, though. The book has been out for a few months now. And, you know, I always try, like you said, I try to check my own biases and always keep learning. We are seeing even bigger changes and that have really started to settle in my own brain in the last few months. And that is the shift to very, very low fertility. So if you look at Hong Kong, it's about 0.7 children per woman on average. South Korea is less than 1 child per woman on average. And I said earlier, 2 things can be true at once. So it's great when you have these packages of family planning and education that really lower fertility from very high numbers to low numbers. That is a lower fertility is an indication that something is going great in society. I'm starting to wonder if we're at an inflection point where very low fertility is an indicator that something is going very poorly in society. So overall, I've been an optimist, but I think we should start paying more attention to this cases where it's very, very low fertility, that people, women in particular, are not comfortable bringing children into the society as it stands. And the fact that it's a global phenomenon is something we need to understand much more.
Do you see any connection to the pandemic? Is this some sort of pandemic hangover?
It's really not, which actually you almost wish it was because then you could explain it easier.
Right.
What was so fascinating about the pandemic from a demographic perspective is it's like turned up the intensity on trends we were already seeing. So we were already having lowering life expectancy in the US, and it turned up the intensity on that. We saw fertility rates falling, and it turns up the intensity on that. There's something bigger happening with the way people think about the future. And it's not just environment, it's economic. And the way that the social relationships are between men and women at the household level. We see marriage, you know, people rejecting marriage, people rejecting building families. And I think that's an indicator that we need to look more deeply into this to say, wow, how have we structured this that people would choose to opt out of this well-established system?
Want to get a final thought from you looking forward. You end the book with this sentence: how can we utilize the 8 billion people we have on the planet today to shape the world we want tomorrow? I read that as much of a challenge
Yeah.
as just an inquisitive question. I'm wondering, what should we be looking to as far as, you mentioned leadership earlier, individuals, countries that are at the forefront of thinking about this and potentially getting it right, because, copycats love success.
Yes. So I think anytime that we can look at pairs of countries that have had similar trends and then see who's been successful and who maybe hasn't been successful, we learn a lot. So I mentioned Botswana and Nigeria earlier. There are lots of paired cases we could look at where it seems as if a society should have really had, like Ethiopia should have had a terrible famine, but and Somalia had similar trends, and they did. What were the differences there? I think looking to Japan, even though as the world's oldest country, like I said, they have really maintained a lot of their economic vitality. That's really a place to continue to look to. I think looking at places like, and when you look at maps of sub-Saharan Africa and you see places where fertility has fallen, look to those countries to say, wow, what did they do? What were these policies that were put in place that made a big difference there? And then when it comes to migration, which is one of the things that we didn't necessarily mention, you know, it is incredibly political everywhere in the world. And I think a mistake would be for us to say that just because a country has a shrinking population, they'll have to open to migration. That's not the case. They will have a national conversation about whether or not the trade-offs of opening to migration are worth it for their society, or accepting population aging and shrinking. But in both cases, it would be, how do you make the most of the people that you have? And looking at investing in those people, keeping skills sharp throughout older ages. Education is the key around the world for really helping a society to flourish.
Thanks. Our guest has been Jennifer Sciubba. Jennifer is the author of 8 Billion and Counting: How Sex, Death, and Migration Shape Our World. Jen, thanks for today. And it's great to have you as part of the Wilson Center, even just for a short time, to add this incredible thinking to our world.
Thanks, John. I appreciate it.
Yeah, terrific. Thanks. We hope you enjoyed this edition of Wilson Center Now, and that you'll join us again soon. Until then, for all of us at the center, I'm John Molesky. Thanks for being here.